Right, well, kia ora, good day, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. I'm Phil Barutha, Assistant Professor and the Durham School of Architectural Engineering and Construction at the University of Nebraska here in Lincoln, Nebraska. I'm also the Principal Investigator for CII, Construction Industry Institute's RT383, which is I2PD Phase 2 project that you heard from earlier from some of our other team members. Bruce and Michael was also a part of the RT341 Phase 1 research project. And then in addition, I'm also a visiting professor at University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. And with me today is Rod Cameron from Down Under, from New Zealand, joining us in the very wee hours of the morning in Christchurch. And Rod, I'll let you introduce yourself to the audience.
Well, given we've slipped a bit of time, I'll just say I'm a humble engineer with quite a bit of experience in project administration on the doing side, and I regularly say to people, I come from the doing end of town. Right, let's get into it.
Okay, Bruce and Michael took you on a journey to the moon this morning. This afternoon, we'll be taking you on a journey down under to describe how a project, or in this case, a program in Christchurch, New Zealand, can be delivered with high levels of collaboration and integration through alliance contracting. But before we do, I just wanted to share this quote from one of the most famous Kiwis or New Zealanders, Sir Edmund Hillary, with a photo from the top of Mount Everest. So that's Mr. Sir Edmund Hillary. Now, most of our presentation will be on project alliancing, but we did want to touch on project partnering just really briefly with the definition. And we're going to get all the definitions out of the way early in this presentation. Now, definitions of partnering vary across the globe. So we did, the way to resolve our conflict on which definition to use, I'm from the US, Rod's from New Zealand, others are from Canada, and we have colleagues from other parts of the world. So we resolved conflict the old-fashioned way with paper, rock, scissors. Of course, I won the best 2 out of 3, so we're using the US definition of partnering here. That first definition comes from a study by CII actually in the 1990s. And the second definition comes from a most recent publication of Partnering Handbook from AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. You see the common thread there, shared goals. Another common thread, trust in commitment, mutual objectives, principles, and then agreed to performance metrics of the project are all woven into that definition. Now, getting into the principles in a little bit more detail of partnering, this comes from the AASHTO Partnering Handbook published in 2018. These are the principles: trust, commitment, communication, cooperation, teamwork, and relationships, issue resolution, measurement, feedback, and continuous improvement, which I would say are the pillars of collaborative contracting as well. But we want to move forward and we want to talk about project alliancing. Now, partnering in the US really can be, what we found is it can be implemented on many different project delivery methods or contractual arrangements. Project alliancing, by definition, is its own project delivery method, or how it's defined, a contractual agreement between multiple parties that create an alignment of participants to goals and objectives. So really taking it the next step, that's all of that is woven into the contract agreement, and the entire project is delivered in this manner. And I'll let you read this definition from the Australian National Guide for Alliance Contracting. But you see here, best for project decisions. I think you've heard multiple teams talk about that. Seems to be the commonality with this, delivery methodologies, integration and collaboration, and then unanimous decisions, definitely woven into the main definition for project alliancing. So these are the principles. Once again, there's some similarities, but this is a contracting strategy. A big principle, a major principle in alliancing is risk and opportunity sharing. Of course, we have no disputes. We have best for project, no fault, no blame, good faith, transparency through open book financials, and oftentimes a joint management structure, which we can talk about briefly. But really what we see in the literature as the biggest difference in alliance contracting versus other contracting strategies is this risk sharing versus risk allocation. And this risk sharing is really amongst all of the key project participants, so from the owners to the designers to the contractors, and then whoever that project deems as key would all be involved in this more risk sharing approach. And if we want to look specifically at risk sharing in construction, under the traditional methodology, typically owners would pass that risk for construction and design to the designers and contractors rather than own that. But in contrast, in alliance projects, this is more of a collective approach where the owner will share in construction and design risk. So this is just trying to show visually the spectrum of various different project delivery methods. And along here, the x-axis, the y-axis is just the risk, shared risk to the owner, being high on the far right of this graphic and low risk on the far left of this graphic. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with public-private partnerships, P3 or PPP, if you're in the UK or down under. From this graphic, and this comes from the Australian guide. From this graphic, that far left, where a lot of that risk is carried by the contractor, passed from the owner, would be that P3 delivery methodology. And you see design build would just be a little bit further out from a P3 with a little bit more risk, but borne to the owner, but not much more. So design build and EPC, or engineering, procurement, and construction, which are oftentimes how industrial projects are delivered today. And then you see along that spectrum, and then alliancing is much further on the right end of the scale, where we talked about where a lot of that construction and design is shared between the owner and the project participants. Of course, if the project were self-managed completely by the owner, they would bear all of it, but alliancing is just a shade to the left of that, and sharing of the risk. Now, you've seen this slide before. We like it so much we recycled it for this presentation. Just a brief background and history on this. Of course, the other team was talking about I2PD, which blends commercial IPD and alliancing, but we want to talk a little bit about the background. Briefly, alliancing, of course, the 1990s. What we were able to track it back to the North Sea, I think, was discussed previously, actually in the industrial setting, and then migrated to down under, primarily in the civil infrastructure space, in Australia and in New Zealand, down under. And of course, we heard about IPD and I2PD earlier in North America, specifically in the healthcare industries in the 2000s. But of note, really what we're seeing is the performance of both of these. There's a lot of similarities with the principles of commercial IPD and alliancing, but we're really seeing very similar performance outcomes between commercial IPD and project alliancing. Cost savings, schedule savings, a pretty high success rate, high quality facilities delivered with no significant cost, and high owner satisfaction. Now, looking at a study performed by a group in Australia, they reviewed performance data on 61 projects delivered as an alliance between Australia and New Zealand in 2008, 2010, and 2012, and not sharing all the performance metrics, but I pulled some of the key information from here. Of those 61 projects, the average actual cost from what was budgeted was, of the aggregate total of the 61 projects, they all came in 4% under budget on average. Now you see graphically each project depicted here on this chart. So not every project came in under budget. You see the far right, but the vast majority came in below the targeted cost, the budgeted cost, the actual end cost. Now, I think another important metric, and you heard some of the previous group talk about this, is value for money. These alliance projects, these 61 alliance projects, also scored much higher in client satisfaction and value for money for the owner, which is a little bit more of a subjective qualitative metric. But as you see here, this would be below expectation, but these were exceedingly or very high or high, with meeting or exceeding the expectations. So very good performance from the subjective perspective from the clients as well, with meeting their major business objectives. Okay, so now what projects are a good fit for Alliance? So we see that they have pretty good performance, at least in those projects that were reviewed in the study, a good track record. But why would you want to do an Alliance, or is an Alliance a good fit for every project? And this graphic comes from New Zealand Transport Agency, or NZTA. They put this together as they're trying to identify good projects to deliver as an alliance, whether it's limited resources or contracting or what have you. They want to pick out the projects that will benefit most from alliance, and so this chart was developed by that team. The x-axis is representative. You see quite a bit of different factors: complexity, risk, potential for innovation, flexibility. On the x-axis or y-axis is scale, so size of project, larger dollar value project, bigger project team. That would represent our scale, our y-axis scale. And you see on the very upper right quadrant is where the alliance sits. So projects with high complexity, projects with high risk, a lot of potential for innovation, larger in scale generally, would be a good fit for an alliance. Whereas if the opposite of that on this graph would be more of a traditional methodology. So if it's a project with low risk or low uncertainty and not a lot of potential for innovation, a little more traditional methodology. Now, design build, of course, here in the yellow, and ECI, which is early contractor involvement, which would be similar in the United States to CM at risk or CMGC, also has a lot of potential on the x-axis here. Now we need to be cautious on being overly engineering this. This is put together more for a guide, not a precision tool to map out to the decimal point on the x-axis and the y-axis. But this is, I think, it gives us a little bit insight on how it's viewed, on what projects would be good candidates for an alliance project. So once selected, this is the selection process, at least from the Australian guidelines on price. There could be a price competition component, or maybe a non-price competition where it's just selected on qualifications. I think you heard Bruce talking about today, or it's more qualification based. So if we look at the right column, the qualification based, you can see there's an expression of interest in a shortlist process. In prior to contract, there's a point through here when a TOC, or a target outturn cost, is developed prior to executing the PAA agreement. So just in a little bit more detail in the selection process, generally once we get to the shortlist, there's a half-day interview process involved with that, 2-day, maybe a 2-day workshop for the final shortlisted proponents. And you may sign an interim project alliance agreement or an IPAA that gets you to where you're developing the target outturn cost, you're developing some of the schedule value management, risk and opportunity workshops, etc., before you get to the full alliance project, the project alliance agreement to execute the project under. So just a little bit about the process. Now, we talked about shared risk and reward, and just breaking down the monetary compensation model. This can vary, but this is typical. This would be also defined in the Australian guide. Would be a 3-limb process. Many of these alliance contracts are delivered under a reimbursable model. So under limb 1 would be the direct cost to the project. So we're talking direct labor, direct material, direct equipment on the project, in addition to project specific overheads. So that could be your supervision, your management, your project trailers, etc., that are involved with the project. Oftentimes that is at no risk that is not at risk to the contractor group, would be the direct costs with the project specific overheads. Now the shared risk would be limb 2, which includes our corporate overhead and the standard profit, where potentially if we see the project go over the TOC, that could be at risk. And of course, everybody wants to be in limb 3, which is the reward area. where there's shared savings on the project where the project has been successful financially. And just talking about the organizational structure before we get into the case study, this is oftentimes how the project team, we talked about a joint management team that's delivering these alliance projects. So I put OP would be the owner parties, NOP would be the non-owner parties that would oversee the respective team. From outside the alliance, ALT is alliance leadership team, usually a team of executives from each of the key participants. And then of course a joint management team or alliance management team, AMT, that's running the day-to-day operations of the project. And then of course our delivery teams that are actually delivering the projects, the engineers, the supervisors that are out there on the front lines. But all of this is under the lens of one team. Delivered as an alliance. Okay, now what we'd like to do is talk to a case study from down under. We talked about briefly, and I'm going to turn it over to Rod Cameron to describe this case study that took place in Christchurch, New Zealand, in response to two devastating earthquakes that happened in a decade ago. And in response to that was an alliance that was formed to rebuild the city, the Stronger Christchurch Infrastructure Rebuild Team, which was a $2.2 billion program spread over 5 years that involved an integration of 3 government entities and 5 private firms or private contractors to execute and deliver the program over that 5-year period. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Rod Cameron to speak to that in more detail.
Out of respect to the time frames, I'm going to really rattle through this and in fact skip over some of the slides. And I don't have control of the advancement, so Phil's the man here. I don't want to insult you by saying that's where we are down there, and of course New Zealand draws it as being in the middle of the perspective. About 45 south, and I'm sure you know where 45 north is. Right, next. The islands, next please, Phil. The islands are peculiar in that they sit on different plates, and not only are those plates quite active, but in the North Island it's on the rising over plate and the South Island rising over, so the area in the middle is a mess. There's a lot more fault lines than shown there. Christchurch is on the edge of a couple of dormant volcanoes or extinct volcanoes. Next, please. So this one, I just want to clip through quite slowly because it's relevant to the physical situation, which gave rise to the contractual situation. An earthquake in September out on the plains, the Green Star, and all the green aftershocks really rattled the city and did perhaps $500 million worth of damage, and probably a lot less than that. Really, we hadn't had time to assess it when the Purple Star, to the pipes and roads, to the Purple Star happened in the February earthquake, and that was the big one. The orange and the yellow continued in the middle of the year. Aftershocks are a feature of earthquakes, and all those little dots there are earthquakes that you could really feel and rattle you. So the population, by and large, wasn't a happy one. The grey outline of the city is clear, and the CBD. That blue line is the Ice Age shoreline. It's beyond that is a deposition since the Ice Age, and it's an absolute mess with a very high water table. So digging and laying pipes or reconstructing roads in the city is a fraught process, particularly the pipes. Next, please, Phil. There's shaking damage, and within the city, just to give you a perspective, 2 buildings of size collapsed, and more than 1,100 needed to be brought down. Of course, the design of the 60s and 70s in New Zealand, as in the United States, was that it shouldn't collapse, and they didn't, but they were useless and not repairable in a common sense. Next slide, please. Another major feature of this is liquefaction, and perhaps 30% of the city was subject to liquefaction. And those silts, when they rose to the surface, also drained away down into the pipe network and compressed like you wouldn't believe. So a major challenge, and I'll come back to this later, was clearing the pipes before we could figure out what needed to be done. However, we did a preliminary assessment. Next slide, please, Phil. And knew the broad scope of what we were to do. This is what subsequently was proven. And the key statistic there, never mind what a New Zealand dollar is compared to American or Canadian or whatever, it's 20% of the GDP of the nation. That's an enormous hit. However, about 3/4 of that was covered by insurance. New Zealand is a very highly insured country, but the pipes and roads and the rivers weren't. And what are we going to do and how are we going to do it? There's all those challenges that you can see there, particularly the uncertainty. And if it's going to involve, say, 2 billion or so, then that's a multiple factor of maybe 6 or 8 times the maximum normal throughput of civil engineering in the city. So as well as that challenge, we knew that we had to make sure of what we were doing and communicate it to the people and keep a community focus throughout, because the people are impacted by this darn thing. Next slide, please. Early in the piece, and I've pinched this slide from Duncan Gibb, the leader of what became the Stronger Christchurch Infrastructure Rebuild Skirt. Duncan was awarded the Brunel International Lecture by the Institution of Civil Engineers, and this describes the key elements that we decided very early in the piece that had to be part of this thing. It's obvious, and I hope it's obvious to you folk, that you can't let a single contractor deal with this. You can't even let a series of contracts, because you're pretty soon going to run out of competitive arrangements. So you've got to have collaboration. But right at the bottom there, intentional development was very high on our minds. Next slide, please. I'm rattling through them because of respect to your time constraints. So here's the structure. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time going into the structure and the remuneration. 3 funders. The Transport Agency and the City Council deal with each other regularly, because one is fed by fuel excise and the other by rates, and they share the maintenance cost of roads, and they have a proud history of never agreeing with each other about anything. And the government's new Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Agency behaved like a superior being. So we had 3 participants there, as owner participants, who had to learn how to work together. The 5 contractors, of course, have never worked together, and they had to learn as well. Somebody else, I think it was John, mentioned coaching. We included coaching, and the board, 1 member from each, had to be unanimous. And they, however, recognizing the scale of what was happening and the importance of the community, quickly learned how to behave properly and work well together. They integrated with the management team. They didn't just dictate and delegate. And so we had a good working arrangement and a good view about what we needed to do and how we needed to behave. I'll come to some of the behavioral things in a minute. The integrated services team was really interesting. So this drew from the 5 contractors, the City Council's people, 16 or 18 different engineering consultancies put people in here under commercial arrangements, competitive commercial arrangements, but we all worked together. Then produced a program of projects. Because we couldn't see what needed to be done immediately, we did work in a sequential manner and designed and priced and issued. The pricing was fixed. So each of these delivery teams, and so they were regional offices set up by the 5 contractors with 30 or 40 staff in them. Each of them was given projects in series with a fixed price, a TOC fixed on it, no negotiation entered into, and then they had to try and deliver for that TOC. The remuneration was all costs with a fee, but the fee was either added to or reduced from the either underwriting or overriding of actual cost versus TOC. Now, an even more cunning element of this was that under or over was shared amongst all 5 contractors. So a poor performing contractor would be pulling down the others. And so without being able to share any financial information, those contractors quickly learn to share the best dewatering principles, for instance, the best aggregate sources, for instance, and so on. And so we quickly got a better working arrangement. We didn't dictate to any of those 5 how they would subcontract or obtain their supplies. And they did that by a range of contractual processes and a range of relationships. But there was a very clear separation there of delivery from the working arrangement in the integrated services team, which incidentally was about 300 people all under one roof with a very strong cultural element to it. Next slide, please, Phil. I'm repeating myself a little, but this is, and this should be obvious to you, but there's a sequence involved here. And I'm pinching this slide from the enterprise called Engage, which is just a concept for how to get stuff done after a disaster. We're talking a post-disaster situation, but I'm going to say to you, I believe that these working arrangements can have real benefit in other situations. So you're assessing, you're working it out, you're scoping it, and then a very tricky process of prioritizing. You can do engineering prioritizing relatively easily, and we did, but then you have to prioritize from a community needs perspective. The funding's confirmed, design and the TOC is set, and then it's delivered. The monitor word is moved. I'm sorry, that should be on the dark blue, but never mind. And there was a very strong monitoring process and performance evaluation process. 5 key result areas, 10 to 12 key performance indicators, and they were renewed every year. And the performance of the contractors, this is another key element to the financial incentive. The performance of the contractors dictated how much future work they got. And so we quite quickly got good performance versus not as good, and real competition around doing better. And we early in the piece decided we wanted to capture lessons. And by the way, the SCIRT Learning Legacy is available for anyone to have a look at, and I'd welcome it and feedback. Next slide, please. So returning to that structure, what are the key things that happened there? I've touched on them already, and you can read it as fast as I can. The high performance I would emphasize, that sounded like a bit of a catchphrase for me in the early days, but I really quickly learned, and I was on a steep learning curve like many of us, that actually you can bring in a culture into an organization under good leadership. And the benefits flowed through to community awareness very early. People relied on us and had confidence in us, and we began to win awards and so on. Next item. This is really for interest of the right-hand column, I think. I described that we had to put cameras down pipes. That was an amazingly high cost, and a lot of that work was done around the clock and in the middle of the night and so on. Design was higher than you might expect, but then quite a lot of it had to be redesigned because we had funding issues late in the piece, which I can describe in a minute. But 72% of the money being pipes in the ground is a pretty good success in my mind. And there's the indirects of delivery and of the integrated services team beyond the design. Thank you. Next slide, please, Phil. Because this involved a community, and we're right in the center of the community in everybody's way. What are the benefits? And I think when you look at those left to right in sequence, you can imagine that this thing became high on people's awareness. And for the reasons that are pretty obvious there, not least of which is openness. We had open book contracting arrangements. As I said, the delivery teams couldn't see each other's financials, but we could see all the way through purchasing and procurement, and the funders understood that and were a party to it. And the whole community, as it saw roads getting done and pipes getting done, gained confidence, and therefore in the disaster arena speak, the whole community was heading toward recovery, helped by this organization. Next slide. When I've spoken overseas, and a few of us went to Italy to compare results with earthquakes, I used to put this slide up, and honestly, it would make me choke with sentiment. The road cones were something that everybody cursed in Christchurch because they were everywhere. But after a year or so, on the anniversary of the earthquake, the community would come out, and I'm choking up now telling you, and put flowers in those road cones. I challenge anyone to say, yeah, that's done all the time in our environment. It's not, is it? And that's a reflection of how the rebuild was regarded. Next click, please, Phil. What did we achieve? There's absolutely no doubt, and I'm sorry, the value of skirt report isn't up on the skirt learning legacy, but it will be in a month or so. The value of skirt shows very clearly that performance lifted. The community engagement was amazing. We surveyed them by telephone and face-to-face, and we had an 80% acceptance rating. We definitely delivered well against the value framework. And as I mentioned earlier, we won awards all over the place. And I was the go-to person with external universities, which is how I met Phil. I dealt with 32 universities from around the world. Next. So this is the next slide is my last. And I want to challenge you that this can be applied elsewhere. Society has not only disasters, but it has a lot of large-scale challenges at the moment. And here in New Zealand, we have water supply issues, we have climate change issues, we've had COVID and the response, the economic stimulus. All of these things are big issues that need to be grappled with by the whole of society. And therefore, the underlying principles of alliancing, where collaboration and bringing parties together, I strongly believe, and a number of us do in this thing called engage, they can be applied to those situations. It doesn't just have to be for an airport hangar or something that's quite difficult to build. It can be also for an issue that society is having difficulty grappling with. Okay, that's it from me. I'm sorry about the pace, but I respect that you want to keep marching to a time frame.
Well, thank you, Rod. Stop share. So we're open for questions.
Thanks very much. I will switch over to slido.com as usual. If everyone could please submit your questions and comments for Phil and Rod here, and they'll be happy to respond. I've just taken the screen control back, and now you should be able to see questions.
Okay. Question for you. What do you think were the key success factors of the Skirt Alliance?
There were two. There was absolutely no doubt that competition was real. Yes, it was collaboration, but those teams really worked hard to be the best out there in the field, and that had a direct flow on to financials. The other was the community engagement and respect. In an environment which has suffered a whole lot of damage, and there were issues left, right, and centre, it was fantastic that at least the pipes and roads are being got on with well, and people understood because of advertisements in the newspaper and radio updates. They understood what was going on.
In an alliance model, the owner assumes most of the risk. Shouldn't the owner then get most of the reward too? How's the risk-reward ratio set in an alliance model?
The financials were that a fee was nominated and agreed in negotiation at the start. So that was a fee on not turnover, but on the cumulative sum of the TOCs. And that fee was either added to or deducted from by under or over performance against TOC by the delivery teams. The setting of the TOCs, by the way, was done by construction industry estimators drawn from the 5 contractors, but they worked in isolation from the 5 delivery teams. It was a very good process, honest and thorough. And as a result, I'm certain that we got all that rebuild work for real net cost plus a modest markup. And I would challenge any other contractual arrangement to deliver that in those circumstances.
Okay. Do alliance projects cost more to deliver?
Rod,
I don't believe.
Okay.
Phil put up a slide which showed that 2 or 3 in Australia had overrun. I know the circumstances of one of those, and it is simply a factor of a poorly set up arrangement where the scope wasn't clearly defined beforehand, and actually that overrun was scope change, not invisible costs that appeared out of nowhere. And the thing to me, and I speak now more as a construction, put a construction hat on, the thing about risks and allowing for risks is understanding them. And the alliance process gives you a very good process by which you can understand the risks. And when you understand them, you can make appropriate allowances. When you imagine that you can pass all the risk to the constructor, what you're actually doing is letting the constructor find out what the risks are, and if they can't in advance, they'll make heavy-handed allowances, I put it to you, and therefore the total cost will be greater than it needs to be. But that's a point of view.
And Rod, if I may also add, yeah, you're right. I think the study, it definitely clearly shows that alliancing is superior in cost certainty specifically. I know the question is asking about overall costs, but we also do subjectively, from the qualitative findings of that study, also indicate value for money. The owner feels like there's better value for money, so definitely cost is a quotient there. But I do want to say, in addition to that, in some of the series of interviews and talking with individuals that are a part of these collaborative or alliance projects, they have spoke to, at least anecdotally, that some of the spending might shift a little earlier. So the cash flow might be impacted to earlier in the project due to some of the early contractor engaging with the key participants earlier in the project. But in virtually almost every interview, it seems that the statement is that this early spending provides savings that's realized later on in the process, almost like a return on investment that you're going to see later in the project, even if you front end load some of the cost, to where the overall cost is not increased, I guess, to what Rod's statement is.
Robert, I'd like to address that question about the interfaces between multiple stakeholders. I described to you that there were 3 funders, and I described that they had a history, 2 of them had a history of never agreeing with each other. They became good, open, sharing people, but then 2 or 3 years into the 5-year program, the government decided in its wisdom to cap its contribution. And that would have meant that we didn't have enough money to do what we'd identified was a reasonable scale of work, leaving some for future. And that process took about a year of redesign and rescheduling and reprioritizing with significant cost, which of course the Alliance was able to accommodate because we just issued the projects in whatever sequence we liked, and the delivery teams had to deal with it. But that just came down to human nature and the willingness of those three parties, the government having capped it, to say, well, the situation is what it is, let's work together and make it happen. So I believe that the Alliance thing, where you have, as John and Tony described, the necessary meeting of minds early in the piece, can set a culture, that can set an awareness, can set working relations that will allow these things to be dealt with better than the alternatives, which are regularly contractual disputes and litigation and all sorts.
We have a question regarding a different part of the world. In economies such as Latin America, where disputes are really common, how do you see alliances working?
I couldn't comment on that because I just don't have enough awareness of Latin America. This thing is very much about culture, and personal culture and organizational and enterprise culture, and the willingness to change and adapt and work for the common good and so on. And if those things are missing, I don't see them working well. But I think there's also a lot of instances where conventional adversarial processes don't work well in those situations. I just want to make a quick comment, which it was touched on by John and Tony. A friend of mine worked extensively in Hong Kong, and it's common in Hong Kong for quite large projects not to have contractual documentation. That's simply a handshake. How can that possibly work? Well, the answer is it can work because in that culture, reliance on each other and performance and reputation is huge. And so if I'm a contractor and want to deliver for you, Robert, I'll guarantee to do it for you. And I won't fail, because if I do, the whole community will know that I've failed, and that'll be the end of my business. So these things aren't just around the words that are written on a page.
Right. Well, thank you, gentlemen.